So we're going to talk about the tongue tonight. Before we do that, let's go through a couple of announcements. Pray for the Valeys. They're going to be traveling to Texas tomorrow. They're going to spend a week or so with family. Pray for Jonathan, not the Martins, but Jonathan will be traveling to Tennessee on Wednesday. And depending on how things go, the Wagstaffs are going to be traveling either this weekend or sometime next week. So keep them in your prayers as well. Yes?
I will be traveling Wednesday and Thursday.
Yes, and he'll be traveling Wednesday or Thursday, only he's actually coming back. So if you want to see if you can swap that out somehow, and I would tell you what he's traveling for and what he's coming back with, but he might get inundated with requests by the end of the day, particularly if you like beef. All right, October's Missions Month, so keep all those things. We won't go through all that again tonight. How many of you heard The Spot? Jan and I did. We listened to it this afternoon. Did you hear it this afternoon? Yeah. I don't know how many people are going to hear that. It does give us some good information about the church and about the trunk or treat. And honestly, I was just really pleased with the lady who did the interview, because she asked not only to ask good questions, but she also had been to our website, knew our address, knew a little bit about our church, and brought all those things in as she was answering questions. So people they must have heard the name of the church in that 10-minute spot probably a half a dozen times at least, and the address a couple of times, heard our website, not only that we have one, but what the address of the website is. And so there was a lot of really good information in there, and that was before I ever opened my mouth. So I really appreciated the work that she did, and that's going to be out there now for quite a bit of time. So be praying about that God will direct that to the ears he wants to hear it, and that we'll have some impact. It's the way they do that. It's a 1-hour deal, and they have these 10-minute segments. So each one of those, they do 3 of them in the first half hour, then they do the news, and they do another 3 of them in the second half hour. And ours was the first on in that hour segment today. I don't know if that's the way it's going to be each time, but it sounds like that could very well be the case. All right, once again, if you want to be one of the voices of Christmas, and if you're not familiar with that idea, it's a dramatic monologue. So we would be having you dress up in period costume, and you would need to memorize your monologue and then deliver that. And our thought is to do it each day leading up to and including the day after Christmas. So what would that be? The 4 Sundays. The last one's the 26th, because Christmas is on Saturday. Backwards, 26th, 19th, 12th, 5th. So those 4 days, there are actually 12 of these voices. We don't necessarily have to do all 12. In fact, if we did all 12, that'd be 3 each Sunday. It's a lot. I would do it if we had 12 people who would volunteer, but that's a lot. So anywhere from 4 to 8 to 12 is what we would be looking to do. And if you would be interested in helping us with that, please let me know, or let Pastor Bailey know. All right, Dr. Hull noted that we were talking about the tongue. So he brought me this sheet, and he said that there are 6 muscles in the tongue: the hypoglossus, the palatoglossus, the genioglossus, the styloglossus, the genea hyoid, did I say that right? And the mylohyoid. And that's just the beginning of this list. So he went through all the things he knows about the tongue from a medical perspective. What's that?
He Googled it.
He Googled it, yeah. So anyway, if you want to know... Oh, that's a real book. Whoa. You must have had to go to one of them old things called a library to find that. Upstairs? Okay. You still have the book, okay.
My library? I have an
1870s. Well, then I was going to say the tongue is still there back in the 1870s. Yeah. Okay, James chapter 3, if you want to open your Bibles there. Last week we talked about the proverbial tongue, and we spent all of our time in the book of Proverbs. And again, I said this last week, but let me just reiterate. There's a whole lot more in Proverbs that we could have touched on. We scratched the surface is all we really did. If you start going through your concordance and start looking up tongue and word and mouth and all the different speech and all the different things that could be a part of that, there are sometimes as many as 6 or 7 or 8 verses in one proverb, one chapter of Proverbs that all talk about the tongue. So in doing what we did last week, we flew low and we covered a lot of ground, but we didn't really even scratch the surface with respect to what Proverbs has to say. But I wanted you to get a sense that Solomon talks about the tongue both from positive and negative perspectives, and then we were going to do a positive and a negative perspective on the following 2 weeks. And tonight will be the negative perspective from James chapter 3. Several years ago, the story was told among Christians that the Chicago Daily News had already set the type to report the second coming of Christ. They had articles all written, it was said, about Christians suddenly disappearing, leaving cars running without drivers and airplanes without pilots. Pastors sometimes use this story in their messages with great effect. But then somebody wrote to a member of the news staff and asked if the report was accurate. He received an absolute denial. No type had ever been set at the Chicago Daily News to describe the Lord's coming, in spite of the fact that the rumor had been circulating for years. The Social Security office did not issue the number 666 to some applicants. Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned, and Jesus did not say that the actual temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days. There's a lot of things that get reported, sometimes by us, that aren't true. We need to ask that question. Just as we get started here, we need to ask the question when we hear things, is it true? And then we also need to ask the question, is it necessary for me to repeat it? We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. What we often say what we say often has a tremendous impact on the people around us. And James, as a pastor, was aware of that. He didn't mince words in describing the tongue in James 3. And I want you to keep in mind that this is not just James' opinion of the tongue. This is God's opinion of the tongue. So I want us to look at some caution statements as we work through James chapter 3 about the tongue. You're going to hear a few comments that sound very much like what we talked about last week in the book of Proverbs. I'm going to mention some scriptures, but we're not going to turn to all of these scriptures. So as we did have notes out, right? So as I mention them, you can write them down and you can refer to them later, and you can see how those play out. All right, James chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect or a mature man, able also to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. So he starts with a word of caution. Don't clamor to be a teacher. The authority of a teacher brings with it the responsibility of a teacher. The authority of the teacher brings with it a greater responsibility than the responsibility that is conferred upon the person who is listening, although everybody who's listening to truth has a responsibility to deal with it, or that is listening to falsehood has a responsibility to respond to that in an accurate way. But the teacher has greater responsibility and greater judgment. Let me share this with you, and I could change the name. The same thing could be said about president right at the end of the Second World War. Truman. Same thing could be said about Truman, but this is about Mark Twain. Church leaders were largely to blame for his becoming hostile to the Bible and the Christian faith. As he grew up, he knew elders and deacons who owned slaves and abused them. He heard men using foul language and saw them practice dishonesty during the week after speaking piously in church on Sunday. He listened to ministers use the Bible to justify slavery. Although he saw genuine love for the Lord Jesus in some people, by the bad teaching and poor example of church leaders, he was so disturbed by the bad teaching and poor example of church leaders that he became bitter toward the things of God. And by the way, his own wife was a godly lady. But he was so damaged in his own thinking by other people and their inconsistency with respect to Christianity that he turned away from that and basically despised Christianity throughout his life. The tongue is an incredibly, and by the way, most of those people were teachers. That's why I bring that illustration out. Pastors, leaders, people in churches that should have been examples of the believer and were not. The tongue is a powerful force, and those who use it to lead others bear a heavy responsibility. Let me say, the first time, as somebody who's planning to be a pastor, the first time I read that passage and applied it to myself, I shuddered. I have to stand before God and not just answer for what I know, for what I've done with what I know. I have to answer for every word that I have uttered as a teacher. It's one of the reasons why I spend time studying before I teach, because I want to get it right. I don't want to say things that are wrong. I know I have. I know I've said things I shouldn't have said. One of the things about being a smart mouth is that somebody who wants to be funny and all that kind of thing is that from time to time you say something you really shouldn't have said. Pops out, and then you say later on, like 2 seconds later on, that was not appropriate, or that was really stupid, or I shouldn't have done that, or somebody's going to be mad, or whatever happens to come into my head. It's a heavy responsibility. And he starts his whole conversation about the tongue by thinking about himself as a teacher and anybody else who wants to be a teacher, wants to be a leader of other people and teach them about the Word of God. All right, verse 2 then talks about control over its power. We all stumble in many things. Control over the tongue does not come easy. It's a process of maturity, and that's what he says. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect, and the word perfect doesn't mean sinless or without any problems at all. It means a mature person, somebody who has grown to maturity. If anybody doesn't stumble in word, that person is mature. Notice that the control over the tongue gives the mature man the ability also, at the end of the verse, to control the rest of his body. And that's what he's going to get into in these illustrations in the next couple of verses. So if you're able to bridle your tongue, you're able to bridle your body. If you can control that, then you can control the rest of it. It's when you can't control that that everything else is out of control as well. Now let's keep in mind, the tongue is a function of the mind. What's coming out of your mouth is what's going on in your mind. So the mind is really involved here. It's not just a matter of, I have this muscle, that has all these other muscles that Doc talked about. I have this muscle, and this muscle is my problem. My problem is that sometimes my mind tells my mouth to say something, and my mouth says it, and my mind had not thought the process through. And what came out of my mouth was wrong, or was sinful, or was hurtful, or was wicked, or was despicable. I mean, a lot of different things can come out of your mouth that are really bad, and that's what James is talking about in this passage. So if you can keep the tongue in line, you can keep the body in line. And then he goes into some comparisons with respect to power. He uses two illustrations. The first one is the horse, and he mentions that one in verse 3. We put bits in horses' mouths, and they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Now, I'm no expert on horses. The last time I was on a horse, I went into orbit and landed on the bumper of a truck face first or head first, and ended up in the emergency room getting stitches. So I'm not an expert on horse. You stop laughing. You stop laughing too. You can all laugh if you want to. So I'm no expert on horses. But you don't control a horse with a rope around its neck. With the exception of maybe a Shetland pony, you're not going to control an animal that size. It's too big. It's too strong. You're not going to control it with a rope around its neck. You're going to have to control it in some other way. And so they use the bit. They put the bit in the horse's mouth. And when the bit is in the horse's mouth, you pull it one way and you pull it the other way. You pull it back, you let go, and the horse is going to respond to that bit. It's a small instrument. Very small. In comparison to the size of the horse, very small. So those of you who know something about horses, is the bit a painful thing? Is that why the horse, why does the horse respond to the bit?
It's a herd animal. It goes where it's pushed or pulled.
Okay, so it's just a matter of push or pull. Okay, pressure. So it's not a pain issue, but it's a pressure issue. So,
It's a pain issue. You're doing something wrong.
well, it was a pain issue when I got on the horse, or when more to the point, when I got off the horse.
That was not the horse's fault.
No, as a matter of fact, if you want the rest of the story, I'll tell you the rest of the story. It was pretty funny to realize that the horse, what the horse knew about me, knew a lot more about me than I knew about it. So in comparison to the horse, the thing that you're using to control it is very small, but it controls a very large animal. So he's back to his thought in verse 2. If you're able to control the very small tongue, you can control the whole body. You can control the horse through this very small bit. And then he goes on to another illustration in verse 4. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they're turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. We have monstrous ships today. I mean, you look at some of these cruise ships, how many decks on that cruise ship, and they aren't even the biggest. Some of the ocean-going, even the aircraft carriers are dwarfed by some of these freighters that they have out there. I think it's called, I wrote it down here, I think, the Emma Marsk, over 4 football fields long, 1,300 feet long. The propeller on that thing weighs 131 tons. Just the propeller. The propellers on the Titanic, the 2 outside propellers, the one in the middle was a little smaller, but the 2 outside propellers, you could, if you could stand on the ground and you could have a guy stand on your head, the 2 of you would reach the middle. You need 2 more of those guys to go all the way across one of those 2 outside propellers. So they're massive. And the rudders on some of these ships are also very large, but in comparison to the size of the ship, not large at all. Very small, as a matter of fact. And when you can't control the rudder, you can't control the ship. I don't know how many of you are students of World War II, but early in World War II, the British were petrified of the Germans' battleship, the Bismarck. And they wanted to sink the Bismarck. They wanted to get rid of it because they thought that the Bismarck would get out into the shipping lanes and would just destroy everything the British had out there. And it was a massive ship. It came face to face with a couple of British battleships, and it blew one of them out of the water, sank in a matter of minutes. It hit the magazine, one of the shells hit the magazine, blew the thing up, and it sank in a matter of minutes and pummeled the other one. So the British sent they were called the Ferry Swordfish. Ferry is probably a pretty good word for it. They were biplanes and they fluttered around, and it was a stormy day when they actually attacked, and they're trying to drop torpedoes. One torpedo hit the middle of the boat and did very little damage. The other one hit the rudder. And it stuck the rudder hard to one side. And the only thing the Bismarck could do was steam in circles. They sent teams down there to try to fix that rudder, and they couldn't fix the rudder. And in the meantime, the British closed in, and they bombarded the ship until it was just a smoking hulk, and and then they sent in a destroyer to finish it off. So the rudder was the thing that doomed, or the stuck rudder was the thing that doomed the Bismarck. Great big battleship, massive guns, but it could not bring them to bear because of what was happening. So he's got these two illustrations. He's got the illustration of the small rudder in comparison to the massive ship. He's got the illustration of the small bit in comparison to the massive horse. And both of those are illustrations of the tongue. And that's what he's talking about in verses 3 and 4. And then in verse 5 he says, even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. That word boast carries the idea of arrogant confidence, but it is not unfounded arrogance. It boasts great things of which it is capable. That statement speaks to the power of the spoken word. I won't read this whole next illustration, but you may be aware of the fact that, or you may not, again, this is a World War II illustration, actually pre-World War II. You may be aware of the fact that Hitler was a master orator. And we think of him as a madman and crazy, and a lot of the pictures of Hitler are at the end of the war when he's ordering about armies that don't exist anymore, and he's gone nuts and all the rest. But as an orator, Hitler was masterful. People still study his speeches to see how somebody could actually move a crowd to the passion that he moved crowds to. And that was who Hitler was. It's part of the reason why he had such a dynamic impact on the German people, because he was such a tremendous orator. The things that he said were horrific. I mean, a lot of them, not everything, but a lot of the things he said were horrific. But he was such a master at putting those things into a perspective that people would swallow, that he took an entire nation right down into the maelstrom of World War and destroyed it through the power of his tongue. Remember that Hitler was not a man of means. He was not a man of he didn't have wealth. He didn't have stature. He didn't have pedigree. None of that stuff. He was an Australian corporal in World War I. What did I say? I said Australian? Yeah, he was not an Australian. He was an Austrian corporal in World War I and fighting for the Germans. And he was a nobody. But he had tremendous powers of persuasion when he spoke. And so the tongue is a powerful, powerful member of our bodies. All right, verse 6. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell. It's often used to do great damage when it's a tool of passion. And the word fire here conveys that idea of passionate speech. The word fire is used 4 times in verses 5 and 6 by James. The Holy Spirit guided James to use that descriptive term because it vividly portrays the passion and the subsequent destructive force of the tongue. Think about a forest fire. We're familiar with them here in Colorado because we're fairly dry. And in a fairly dry time frame, somebody can be traveling down the road and flick a match out the window or a cigarette out the window, and the next thing you know, within a few days, you have thousands upon thousands of acres that have burned. California right now, and I don't know how some of these got started, but oftentimes it's a small spark that starts these things. In California right now, they're measuring the acres in millions, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. So it is phenomenal how much damage can be done from a little spark, and that's what he is saying in verse 6. In the same way, a single word spoken in the heat of the moment can do permanent, enormous damage. I don't know how many of you have heard the parable of the pillow, the feather pillow. The parable of the feather pillow is the story of the man who has said something that was hurtful in a Jewish community, and he comes to his rabbi and he says, "Rabbi, this is what I said. I shouldn't have said it, and I'm sorry. I mean, I've hurt you and I've hurt others." And the rabbi said, "I understand. What should I do?" And he said, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go home, grab your feather pillow, and I want you to go to the square, and I want you to tear it open and scatter the feathers, and then come back and see me." So the man did that and came back to the rabbi and said, "Now what do I do?" And he said, "Now go gather up the feathers."
That would have been.
I mean, the point of...
Blowing, you might have been there for a couple of days.
Yeah, I mean, with the breeze blowing, he'll never gather all those feathers. There will be some that will be gone. And it's the same way with when we use our mouths in a negative fashion. That stuff spreads like wildfire. Well, what's the old saying? A lie has gone all the way around the world when the truth hasn't yet got its pants on. And we can spread enormous damage just with a single word. And then in verses 7 and 8, he says, "For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison." That's a pretty strong statement. He starts again with another illustration. He mentions 4 different types of animals: the beast, the bird, the reptile, and the creature of the sea. And he said all of them have been tamed. The beast would be a dangerous and possibly a venomous animal. The word for bird, obviously, the flying animal, free and hard to catch. The serpent would be a creeping thing, a reptile, repulsive to most people, and again, possibly venomous. And the things in the sea would be the things that are outside of our domain. You can swim in the sea, but you better not go down under the water for very long, because it's not your domain. We live in the air. And James says we can tame these creatures, but he also says the tongue is a different story. We can tame all these things, but we can't tame the tongue. Regardless of our success with animals, we don't have success over our own mouths. James calls the tongue unruly, which is a word that means unrestrainable. It's out of control. On top of that, the freewheeling, unrestrained tongue cuts a deadly swath through people and through families, like your family at home or our church family, with poisonous destruction. So let's get a little bit more specific here. In relationship to the truth, Scripture speaks of the tongue. It speaks of the tongue being a deceiving thing, deceives each other. Psalm 50, verse 19. Here's where some of those scriptures I mentioned earlier are going to come in. Psalm 50, verse 19. Proverbs 12, verse 5. It's a deceiving thing. And by the way, deception isn't necessarily false. You can use truths or half-truths to deceive people. So it can be deceptive. It can be outright lies. Psalm 109, verse 2. Proverbs 6, verse 17. Proverbs 6:17 is the beginning of the passage where he says, "These six things the Lord hates, yea, 7 are an abomination." First one is a proud look, and the second one's a lying tongue. Treachery. Isaiah chapter 33, verse 1 talks about treachery. Flattery, and we talked about this last week. Psalm 5:9, Proverbs 26, verse 28. In every case, Scripture speaks of the impact of those kinds of things, deceptive things, false things, as poisonous. The deceitful use of the tongue is poisonous. And then in relationship to the Lord, the Bible speaks about our speech. What kind of language do you use? Do you use the Lord's name in vain? Exodus 20, verse 7 tells us not to do that. And also says, by the way, Exodus 20, that the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So do you use the Lord's name in vain? Is that something that is a part of your speech? How about the so-called Sunday school swear words? You know what a Sunday school swear word is, don't you? That's the one that sort of sounds like the bad word, but it's not exactly the bad word, and so Christians could use them. Okay? And often do. We sugarcoat them. They're sound-alikes, and we sugarcoat them. What about vulgar language or foul language? Well, I haven't taken the Lord's name in vain, but it's putrid speech. Well, that kind of talk is poisonous. It's poisonous to us. It's poisonous to our relationship with the Lord, and it's poisonous to the other people who have to hear it. I don't know about you, but when I'm around people who use that kind of language, it's not very long before I just start to ache inside. Not physically. I mean, my spirit, personally, I start to ache inside a little bit because I just get tired of hearing that. I get tired of hearing them taking the Lord's name in vain. I get tired of hearing them using foul language. I get tired of hearing, the dirty joke or whatever it is. You say, how's it poisonous to us? Eventually that stuff comes out of your mouth. If it goes into your head over and over and over again, eventually it'll come out of your mouth. I hear from time to time, I hear about people who have, all of their lives have been very careful about their speech, and then they develop Alzheimer's or develop some other form of dementia. And the next thing you know, they are cursing like a sailor. Why? Because all that stuff was stored up here. And they didn't say it when they were conscious of what they were saying, but when they were no longer conscious of it, it came out. So you can do a tremendous damage to other people by using that kind of language. I mentioned in relationship to ourselves, it poisons us. We do damage by the use of a proud tongue, Psalm 12, verses 3 and 4, and of course what we were just talking about with the language. And pride is a form of lying. You realize that's the case. That's what God says. You speak of yourself with proud tones or proud words, and you're lying to yourself. That's not who you are. You're not king of your own domain. So it's a form of lying to yourself, and it's a way that you put yourself in position to fall. What goes before a fall? So it's a poisonous tongue to ourselves. And then in relationship to others, we gossip sometimes. And remember that gossip can be a true statement. Gossip doesn't have to be false. It can be true, but not necessary. Love covers a multitude of sins. Love doesn't reveal everything it knows. We slander their good names. We backbite and talk about their failings when they aren't around. Somewhat similar to the concept of gossip. We accuse them falsely. We speak in angry tones, offending those around us. In his book, Did I Say That?, Leslie Flynn told of a bitter message that was discovered on a gravestone in Milford, New Hampshire. It charged that a certain church had murdered one of its members, murdered is in quotes, by gossip and false accusations. After her name and the date of her death in 1838, these words were inscribed. Age 33, she was accused of lying in church meeting by the pastor and a deacon, their names are given on the gravestone, was condemned by the church unheard. She was reduced to poverty. At this point, the inscription stated that the church closed the matter to all discussion. The message on the marker concluded, the intentional and malicious destruction of her character and happiness as above described destroyed her life. Her last words on the subject were, tell the truth and this iniquity will come out. You know why I read that? Because that was a church. We have the capability of destroying people. Sticks and stones can break my bones. But a false accusation of lying or a false accusation of whatever it may be can be enormously destructive. We need to be very, very careful. Now, I hear from time to time about churches that do church discipline and that they're almost cranking out a church discipline every month. Just nonstop church discipline. We have not done church discipline that way at our church. We've only all the way followed through twice. And in both of those cases, it has taken months to get to that point because we have tried to do our dead level best to be sure that what we were going to say was accurate and was true. We don't have any, there is no reason for us, there's no excuse, that's the word I'm looking for. There is no excuse for us to deal in false accusations. Is it going to happen from time to time? Yeah, because we're still sinful people. But there is no excuse for that, especially with respect to church discipline, which is what it sounds like this was. So let's reflect on our own speech. Are you characterized by poisonous speech? Is that what comes out of your mouth? Do others have to put up with deception from you and with pride and with gutter language and gossip when you open your mouth? How about sarcasm? I'm finishing up a book by Carl Truman, and I can never get the title right, but it's like The Triumph of the American Self, or something of that nature. And in this last chapter, he's talking about how Christians respond to the whole emotive approach to life that we live in today, and LGBTQ and all the rest of it. And he says that what he hears in Christian circles and in churches, not only with respect to the outside world, but with respect to each other, is a ton of sarcasm. That we are sarcastic people. That we can't say what needs to be said in a manner that is straightforward and honest and logical, and so we resort to sarcasm. It's wrong. That's not how we should be doing it. And by the way, let me say, I'm guilty. I've used sarcasm. And there may be a place for it from time to time, but it should be more in jest than in terms of the other, because if we can't argue our cases on the basis of truth and in a way that respects the dignity of the people that we're talking to, then we shouldn't be doing that. God help me. And let me just say, I confess that as sin. And as a church family, we need to be careful about that. I get the sense that we are pretty sarcastic sometimes about other people, particularly those with whom we do not agree. Let's clean up our tongues. We need to be nourishing others with our mouths rather than poisoning them. And then in verses 9 to 12, James lets his pastoral frustration come out a little bit. With the tongue we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. You use your tongue to worship and praise God, he says. You sing his praises, you pray, you preach to others, and then you turn around and you destroy those people with your caustic and callous and angry and poisonous speech. Out of the same mouth, out of the same spring, comes fresh water and salt water, bitter water. That paradox was too much for James. I mean, you can hear it in here. My brother, these things shouldn't be this way. Which side of our mouths should God believe? One more illustration that I'll read for you. A father asked the blessing at breakfast in his usual manner, thanking God for what he had provided. After he said amen, he resumed his habit of grumbling about hard times, about the poor quality of the food, about the way it was cooked, and much more. His little daughter listened with unusual attention and dared to interrupt him by saying, Daddy, do you think God heard what you said when you prayed? Certainly, he responded with confidence. And did he hear what you just said about the bacon and the coffee? Of course, he replied meekly. Then, Daddy, which did God believe? Which one did God believe? And again, we can gripe, and some days I can be the king of gripe. But our mouths should be sending out sweet. Our mouths should be reflections of God, not responses to our circumstances. Every mouth, every tongue should be delivered to its owner, packaged with James' caution statements in James chapter 3, verses 9 to 12. Speech is a wonderful gift. I mean, God gave that gift to us In some cases, Jesus gave that gift to people who had been born without the ability to speak when he was here on earth. It's a wonderful gift. But the downside potential of speech is huge. And if we don't learn to control the tongue that we've been given, we have the potential of doing enormous, enormous damage. All right, we've got about 15 minutes. Let's open this up and let's chat a little bit about this. Yes, Gene? Oh, let me turn this down. I know it gets hot in here in a hurry, but we can't hear. And please remember you're in a fairly large room, so speak up.
I don't want to open up Pandora's box, but we talk about our tongue and how we need to control it. But we need to be very careful how we listen to other people's tongue also. Because when you listen to our politics and you listen what's going on in our courts, so much of that is truth sprinkled with deception or half-truths.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it behooves us to listen very carefully to what other people say and make sound judgments based upon what they say. So politics, I mean, if you look at three major news channels on TV and the same incident, you're going to have three different spins on it depending upon what that company wants you to hear.
Yeah. We call that discernment, right? When I hear something, I need to be discerning about what I'm hearing and to recognize that the fact that somebody says it doesn't necessarily make it true, or the fact that they have spun it in a certain way doesn't mean that there's not another way to look at this thing. So we need to be careful about it. What you're talking about is listening rather than speaking.
We have a tendency to repeat that stuff.
Yep.
That comes off of Channel 5, and Channel 10 is totally different. Channel 21 is totally different.
Yep.
So we got to be real careful. Repeating the truth can real soon turn into harmful gossip.
Yeah, and that's the very first thing we said. Is it true? Is the thing that I just heard, is that really true? Or am I... unfortunately, a lot of the people who are fact checkers now are not fact checkers. They are perspective checkers. And if your perspective is wrong, then they're going to tell you that your facts are wrong, when in point of fact that may not be the case. But the idea of being careful that what you say is actually accurate. I mean, for a long time, I've got this in my file. For a long time, we were getting all this information about what Madalyn Murray O'Hair was doing. And the stuff that was circulating was actually more damaging than anything that Madalyn Murray O'Hair could have ever done. But it was circulating out there that she had this agenda and she was doing this and she had this court saying this, and none of that stuff was true. But it was published and it was out there, and you got letters in the mail and signed by Dr. So-and-so and who's a pastor at such and such a church. And I mean, it's ridiculous stuff. And unfortunately, it hasn't gotten better. It's gotten worse with social media. We pick up things on social media and just repeat them. Was it true? I don't know. I heard it on Facebook or read it on Facebook. Okay, well, that's not an answer. May or may not be true. Doc, did you ever, or Ken, you had your hand up.
Benjamin Franklin said, and he had a whole book of these sayings, 1,000 horses can't hold back one unkind word.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of the same thing as that feather pillow thing. Once it's out, it's out. I take it back. Too late. So, yes.
I know that I feel that God spoke to me about that, because when I hear those words now, it physically affects me. It's so painful.
You talking about cursing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It hurts my ears. And some people, say it, 4 or 5 times until you just want to shudder, And so I just, I don't want to do that to other people, so I'm not going to say those
it's good for us to be bothered by sin. It should bother us. It should bother us in us. It should bother us when we're exposed to it. So, good. Ken?
Well, I pray for our pastors quite a bit. And
Thank you.
in 63, our youth pastor on a Wednesday night prayed about the Good Samaritan. And here we were taken off on Saturday for a camp on 115 and on Highway 50. And here was this broke down car. And I walked to the front of the bus and I said, what do you got against those old people in that OB Silver that's broke down? If you're not a good Samaritan, if you don't do what you said, what are they? They're not a motorcycle gang. So we had to try and turn this bus around on Highway 50. And I made him live up to what he said. And there was a small wire on the generator. We hooked it up and gave him a start. But I made him do what he said. They weren't going to hurt nobody. We gave them a push and they were on the way. They wanted to pay us. I said, no, we're doing what we set out to do to help you out.
Yeah. Well, and that's the reason for what James said at the beginning of the chapter.
Yeah,
Be careful. If you're a teacher, be careful.
yeah. If you're a teacher, you got to be factual.
Yeah. I mean, again, my mouth has gotten me into all kinds of trouble over the course of my life. And it wasn't all at the beginning.
No.
I mean, it's sort of funnel shaped, right? There was a lot more at the beginning than there is now. But my mouth has gotten me into a lot of trouble over the years. And I wish I could say that wasn't the case. I wish in talking about something like this that I could say that I've not been somebody who has said or uttered things that were hurtful, but I have. And the result of that is that other people have been hurt. I have enemies in this life. And in some cases, they have reason to be my enemies. That's important for us to do our dead level best to avoid, if we can. But as a teacher, you're gonna respond to a higher level of. You have a higher level of responsibility. Yes, Joel.
It is on Facebook, it's almost easier to click share than it would be to say something out loud. And it has been disturbing to have people we know first have like a prayer request, and then the next share included a profanity or vulgar. And when you see that to others, it sticks out painfully. But on the other hand, I know I have looked at something, wow, that's on target, that's on point. Share, and I should not.
Yeah, well, we at least we need to verify, right? What was President Reagan? Trust but verify. We need to verify before we're going to share stuff like that. We need to verify it. There are benefits to things, to social media platforms like Facebook, but there are also huge dangers. There's so much information out there, and so much of it is false, or is only partially true, or is shared with a perspective that's not accurate, even though it may be true. So we do need to be careful. Patty?
There's that game we used to play when we were little kids. And so we'd start on one end, and they just turn to the other guy's here, and by the time we get to the other side, it's completely different. So that seems like what happens on the big front, like on Facebook or stuff like that, or even with the news, is that people spread it, and it keeps on changing that whole time.
And why did our youth leaders have us play that game? It wasn't just for fun. I mean, it was an instructive game. It helped you to realize that even though the person at the front end said this, what came out at the other end wasn't, a lot of times it wasn't even remotely close.
No.
Not even remotely. None of the same words were involved. And it's humorous and it's funny and you laugh, and then you realize that's what happens when the story gets shared, and then it gets shared again, and then it gets shared again. We have this nasty tendency to embellish, right? The story isn't quite graphic enough, or doesn't quite grab us like it would have if I would add this little item to it that I think is probably true. So, Gene, you had your hand up.
When it comes to social media, there's no immediate threat of repercussions. If people say
does. People who have studied social media have said that there is a sense of anonymity in social media. So when you type something or you click share or whatever it is, there's a sense that I am sitting in front of my computer by myself. There's nobody else around, and even though intellectually you know that you're sharing this with a lot of different people, there is this sense of anonymity that goes with it. So that, like you said, if you were face to face with a person, you would never have said that. You wouldn't have used those words. You wouldn't have attacked them in the same way that you're attacking them. But since you're not face to face, you're anonymous, so to speak. Then people go ahead and do it. It's not true. It's a false sense of anonymity, but they have that sense anyway.
And it could be 100% true, but the world doesn't need to know it.
Yeah.
That's the issue.
You guys who've been in the military understand the concept of need to know, and there are some things that a private doesn't need to know. There are some things that a colonel doesn't need to know. There are some things that no matter how far up the chain of command you go, there's somebody up higher who needs to know, but you don't. And the same thing is true with a lot of information that we have about other people. There are things about me that Jan knows that you don't need to know. There are things about her that I know that you don't need to know.
That's right.
There are things that David knows about me that I hope he doesn't think you need to know. Right? So we don't need to share everything we know. Again, coming back to the concept, love covers a multitude of sins. It doesn't reveal everything it knows. And again, whether it's true or false doesn't necessarily make a difference. David? You're not going to reveal something you know, are you?
No.
Okay.
I've seen this in homes where from the time the children are small, they know everything that goes on in the home. They know the finances, they know the relationships, they know all this stuff. And then we had a situation where a man said something about another worker at home. Then the other worker shows up and works, and Dad compliments him on his work, which he had just ripped the guy apart previously at lunch an hour before. His son was there. And you know, sometimes 5-year-olds just say what's on their mind. And the son said, "Daddy, that's not what you said at lunch."
Or at a company picnic.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
Somewhat similar to the illustration we read about the guy who's prays and honors God in his prayer, but then gripes about everything that he just honored God about. So,
Similar, right,
yeah,
right.
similar situation. Yeah, children are honest, sometimes brutally honest, sometimes honest at the most inopportune times for us. So, yes.
I just wanted to share something and put it out as a warning to those people who use Facebook and whatever those other ones are. Back in 2012, just before I left the sheriff's office, they was going through a hiring process. And I knew 2 or 3 of the guys that was on the board that was going through the paper applications and had a short lunch with them. They started at 8 o'clock that morning with a little over 350 applications. By 9 o'clock, they was down to 90. And all they did was get on Facebook and look what these people had said and what other people had said about them and had commented through the same conversations. They eliminated that many people who became unqualified. So I tell people, be very, very careful if you want to get on Facebook or Twitter or any of that other kind of stuff, because it doesn't make any really difference what you say, but you've opened up the door for other people to comment about you, whether it's true or not.
Yeah. Yeah. The more we connected on those things and the more we share, even though somebody could say something about you that is patently untrue, it gets out there, and most of the people who read that share don't know whether it's untrue or not. So There's a lot of potential for damage in those situations. Well, our time is up. Let me say that I think one of the things that gossip is a very important aspect of what we're talking about, and a very difficult aspect for us to control, because we hear something that we think is important about someone else, and we think we have to share it. We think it's important for us to open our mouths and share. In fact, we think that by sharing that, we demonstrate that we are in the know. And we share something that should not be shared about another person. Some of us work in, I grew up in a Christian home. I went to a Christian high school. I went to Bible college and seminary, and I went to seminary again. I've spent most of my life around people who are careful about their language. Some of you have not. You've spent your life around people who are not careful about their language and who use all kinds of taking the Lord's name in vain, use all kinds of profanity, use all kinds of disgusting language. And you've grown up around that stuff. You can't unhear it. But you can be careful that you don't repeat it.
That's right.
And sometimes we get in this situation that says, you know what, yeah, but I was in this situation. I was around hockey players for all my life, and those guys swear like sailors, drunken sailors. So, that's just what comes out of my mouth. No, sorry. Wrong. Shouldn't come out of your mouth. So be careful about that. Be careful about what you say. Be careful about who you talk about and why you talk about that person. Let's build each other. That's what our mouths were built for, to build each other up rather than tear each other down. Are there times when you have to say something negative? Of course. My parents didn't say everything positive to me. It wasn't always, oh, nice, Stanley. A lot of times it was, go to your room and I'll be in there in 5 minutes, Stanley. And it was painful. And there were times when my parents had to say negative things. That's fine. I understand that. And we should all understand that. But we need to be building each other up with our mouths. Gene, I'll give you the last word and then we're going to close in prayer.
That grapevine is faster than electronics. Be careful of that.
Yeah.
That grapevine is so quick, it is amazing. And I've seen that, especially in the military, that grapevine is fine-tuned.
Yep. I can't remember which movie it is. It's a World War II movie, and they say the scuttlebutt aboard ship had 1,000 different destinations. None of them true. They're headed towards someplace that they're going to attack, and they haven't told the soldiers yet. Scuttlebutt aboard ship had 1,000 different destinations, and none of them was true. And it's true. When you say it's faster than electronics, in the electronic age in which we are right now, the digital age, we've only speeded that up. I mean, it gets to so many people so quickly. And again, it's not something you can just take back. So, all right, let's stand together. Samuel, would you close us in a word of prayer? I've been doing this back and forth, but I haven't gotten all the way over to there. So I just realized you're still here.